Okay. As you're planning for your marketing strategy for 2024, you might be thinking, is my business going to be able to benefit from a podcast? Is it something that's a nice to have or a need to have? And the reality is that most businesses can benefit from a podcast. But the more important question to ask yourself is, what do you want your podcast to accomplish for your business? So if you're a locally owned business, you might be wondering, well, do I need a podcast because there's global reach for a podcast and I'm a local business and the majority of my clients come from my backyard? The answer is yes. A podcast can absolutely serve a local audience in a really powerful way. The key to the success in that strategy is to craft your content, your call to action, and all of the initiatives for your podcast to be focused on the geography of where you do business so that you're cultivating and growing that audience in the area where people can find you and do business with you. A nonprofit organization is actually a great business model for a podcast. Why? Because nonprofit organizations are driven by fundraising and donations and building community. Podcasts are great for community building. And if you really want to give potential donors and fundraising events and initiatives a really great opportunity for visibility, you could use your podcast content to really showcase the mission and values of your organization. And global businesses, absolutely, because of course, podcasts have that global reach. But if you're a global business and you're making that decision as to whether or not a podcast is the right marketing strategy for you for 2024, then you really need to evaluate two things. One is the purpose of the podcast to build thought leadership, brand awareness, and align the brand's mission and values with the podcast content so that people consuming it can get a really good introspection into the organization, and then build the podcast host visibility around subject matter expertise and thought leadership? If yes, podcasting is perfect. If you are wanting to invest in a podcast to generate visibility, leads, and sales for the organization, is that a perfect strategy for a podcast? Yes. However, it's a different strategy. So you want to make sure that the content that you're creating, that the calls to action that you're putting into place, and all of the ways that you're communicating with your listeners, both via the podcast content itself, the calls to action, and the follow-up options, are all driven to the same objective, which is to gain visibility, leads, and sales for your business. We've even seen global tech companies that have used podcasting effectively to drive traffic to national and international conferences to have lead generation tips and tricks put into place in advance of the conference, and seen the podcast be really successful for being able to get them in-person appointments at these conferences. So that's taking a global outreach and then really narrowing it down into an objective that was a very specific goal. So no matter what your business is, local, nonprofit, global, and everything in between, it's not about whether or not the podcast would be a benefit for you. It's really, how is your podcast going to benefit your audience, and then encourage them to want to continue the conversation with you and ultimately do